Hi, I'm Kristen Oaks-White.
And I'm Avery Davidson. Thank you for joining us for This Week in Louisiana Agriculture, the only TV show bringing Louisiana farmers and consumers together every week.
$367 million. That's the current estimate of agricultural losses due to statewide flooding in March and August of this year, according to the LSU AgCenter.
About 3/4 of that is from the August flooding alone. Now the clock is ticking fast for farmers to report that damage and for Congress to approve aid to help rural communities rise above the storm. Fertile fields covered with water, cattle with no grass to eat. What you're looking at here is not from the August flood. This is from March of this year in North Louisiana. Shots which show the plight of Louisiana's farmers and ranchers this crop year.
Since 2016 began, back as early as February, we've been dealing with weather issues, and not just the normal weather issues, but severe weather issues, starting with 2 flood events in North Louisiana that were depending upon where you were, 500 to 1,000 year events. And then we followed by a summer that never really got dry. Well, we certainly had some hot weather, but didn't get overly dry across much of the state. And then now followed by the difficulty we've seen especially in the southern parishes in the last month. So weather's been a big factor.
Craig McCain is the Louisiana Executive Director for the Farm Service Agency, the arm of the United States Department of Agriculture, which helps people involved in agriculture get the money they need to get started or in times of disaster. LSU AgCenter economist Kurt Guidry estimates the losses from the March floods at roughly $90 million. Guidry calculates the losses from the August flood at more than 3 times that, $277 million.
This is going to be a very, very difficult year for many of our producers. And really, you got to go back to 2015 even, with the Red River flooding in 2015, then the March flooding in 2016, now the August flooding in 2016. And you combine that with low commodity prices both last year and this year, and current projections for commodity prices to stay relatively low into 2017. It does give you a lot of concern about the financial well-being of many of our farming operations moving forward.
Agricultural prices are going down relative to recent history, and unfortunately there's not a whole lot of good news in the near future. And so producers were already struggling economically to address their needs, to balance their balance sheets, to come up with positive cash flows. And so the difficulty they've faced with the weather has just made everything even more difficult and difficult for them to manage.
McCain says there are disaster programs administered by the FSA which could help, especially for ranchers. But you must report those losses soon.
There's a 30-day window of time that producers, depending upon their program needs, need to make reports to FSA about their losses. We're nearing that 30-day window depending upon when that loss occurred or when you noticed that loss on your farm. I would strongly encourage producers who lost livestock or who lost feed, such as hay or even feed that they purchased as a result of this flood. I'd encourage them to contact FSA immediately. One of the most difficult things to deal with from an FSA perspective is when producers have demonstrable losses, but they fail to report them on time.
Congressman Ralph Abraham represents Louisiana's 4th Congressional District. During the March flood, he was delivering sandbags to his constituents. And as a farmer himself, he knows exactly the challenges ahead for agriculture. The problem is, many of his fellow members of Congress may not when disaster aid packages come up to a vote.
Yeah, unfortunately, both of these events, both the March and the August event, did not receive a lot or if any national media. So we're having to educate as a delegation the other congressional members that really had no clue to the severity and the horrific damage that we suffered. So, one of our jobs is not only to obtain and ask for this money, either in the supplemental or the CR, but to make sure that members here in Congress vote for it when it comes up for a vote.
McCain says recovering from these floods is not just important to farmers and ranchers, but the rural communities in which they live.
When you look at what's going to happen in some of these local communities relative to their tax base, relative to their ability to support their local government entities, so many communities in this state are dependent upon agriculture. It's the largest industry in the state, second to oil and gas. So when you say that, there's certainly going to be local impacts. There's certainly going to be difficulties, not only with individual producers, but even within communities that depend upon agriculture. So this disaster's impact is going to be felt far and wide.
I know these people. I've lived among them. I've been their doc. I've been their veterinarian. And so, this is a subject that is very near and dear to me. And my concern is, again, going back to lack of media coverage, and now that we are into a good weather pattern, is that people will simply forget. And again, we can't let that happen. Either in agriculture as opposed to residential areas, where maybe in a residential area you have piled up carpet, piled up sheetrock, piled up furniture on the side of the road that serves as a constant reminder. In agriculture, we don't have that. Somebody simply driving by field said, "Oh, the crop looks great," but I know as a farmer myself that that's not true. That those beans are sprouting within the pod, that cotton boll is rotting on the stalk. So the intangibles are something that we have to also educate people on.
Dr. Guidry says this will likely be the last estimate released before harvest. We'll hear more from Congressman Abraham next week.